So without any further ado, I'll get straight onto it. So these are fairly random. They don't cover evenly across modern Korean history, and in fact, they we start the story before Korean history. The first thing, as Brother Anthony said, I spent 2 years studying Korean language and literature at Danbuk University, which was a fantastic experience. At that stage, I really had no intention of becoming, I suppose, what I'm known chiefly as, which is a North Korean specialist. In fact, the further I got away from North Korea, the better I kind of felt about it. I spent just a fantastic time being immersed in the world of traditional Korean scholarship, and that especially through the various excursions we did to far-flung Confucian academies, so on, way down in the country. It really opened my eyes to a lot of aspects of Korean history that otherwise I think I would have tended to pass by. So it's not exactly myths that I'm talking about. It's more or less just habitual ways of thinking about the Choson era. I kind of take issue with two of them. The one that is frequently heard, that Choson is the victim of frequent foreign invasions, and also that Joseon had a hermit kingdom mentality. The mentality thing is important because, of course, yes, in many ways it was a hermit kingdom. But somehow the first one, the foreign invasions, represents a broadcasting back onto Korean history, something that really only became a significant factor with the fighting of the Sino-Japanese War on Korean soil in 1894-95, and of course the Korean War itself. The thing that I tended to find, because in the course of my studies I tended to do a sort of huge amount of reading on very specific specialist monographs, is that the invasions thing is in no small part a myth put apart by the Japanese, or put around by the Japanese. And this particular quote actually comes from our own transactions in 1913, where a Japanese government general spokesman by the name of Komatsu Midori wrote this incredible thing, which is well worth reading if you have a chance. You can access it through the website, but it's almost, well, in a sense it's chilling, because it really is a blueprint for the cultural extinction of Korea, and this is one of the typical things. Now, the whole point about foreign aggression, foreign invasions in Korea is that you can approach this many ways: psychological, actual, whatever. But in 500 years before 1894-95, Korea suffered one outright sustained invasion, 6 years of the Imjin-Weran, or the Imjin War, during which briefly there was war up and down the peninsula, but after 18 months to 2 years, hostilities were confined largely to the south. Then there were the two Manchu punitive raids in, 1627, was it? And 1636. And that's it, 500 years. Now, anyone who goes through the European tradition would say, oh, you guys got off lightly. So, it's very difficult for somebody, as I said, coming from a European tradition, to have great sympathy for poor Korea, always invaded throughout its history. I just can't really find a great deal to support that as a valid generalization. The hermit kingdom mentality, what's often not appreciated is that China from the mid-15th century also had a hermit kingdom, or hermit empire. It wasn't exactly hermit because China's just much too big. But China turned inward about 50 years or so into the Ming Dynasty. And once China turned inward, there was absolutely no use Joseon doing anything other than that. And of course, they were joined for very different reasons by the Japanese, who entered into their Sakoku policy not too long after that as well. And so Again, how long ago? About a century and a bit, with the establishment of the Tokugawa shogunate, Japan became a closed country. So isolationism was in fact a practical policy that I do not think represents a very significant issue, or shall we say a valid statement of Korea's outlook on the world as a whole, especially when one remembers that for roughly 700 years before the Ming Dynasty and before Choson increasingly turned inward, Choson's contacts with the outside, with the regional world, both its northern neighbours, the Khitan and the Joseon, and of course with the various Chinese dynasties, were multifaceted and were quite active as well. So these are two little things, I think, two little issues that I think really deserve revisiting and thinking through a little bit more carefully. The other thing is more generally, there's a slightly schizophrenic view of the Choson dynasty in the sort of, the grand generalization of the consensus Korean historical view of Joseon. Wonderful arts, but really the Joseon dynasty was stagnant. It ended up sort of selling the nation down the river to the Japanese. Generally speaking, not a very favourable view of Choson, especially politics and ideology. I believe the Choson dynasty is badly underrated, as I say in my book at one stage. Whether male or female, Koreans by 1850, elite, non-elite, they thought, worshipped, spoke, wrote, ate, and acted in ways that were quite different from their 15th century ancestors. Now, for them to achieve that, a small population, a bit hard to accurately sort of assess the size of the population. Consensus probably, I'd be fishing here, but about 8 to 10 million. 90% living in small agricultural villages. The cultural dynamism of Choson is something which is strongly underestimated. And it wasn't just something that occurred at court level, it occurred throughout the entire society. Now if we move forward and then coming into the late Choson period, again, Choson has no friends. That's something that you very quickly learn when you start to study Choson in any detail. And the achievement of late Choson statecraft and civil society is largely ignored. One of the big things, of course, was that Choson just simply could not raise the capital it needed for comprehensive modernization programs. Japan was able to do that, but the moment that the Chinese stepped in after the Treaty of Tianjin in 1884-85, the Chinese were constantly hemming the Korean court in, and then of course the Japanese did likewise. It was in no one's interest, no neighbour's interest, that Choson had a full and fair go at developing itself and modernizing itself. But despite, and also not only that, but the historiography is almost unrestrainedly hostile. But despite all this, an embryonic modern state was emerging at the time of the Japanese protectorate takeover in 1905. There was a centralized bureaucratic state, a significant military force. If any of you are familiar with Carter Eckert's recent book, first volume, that's just come out, the way that he has detailed the early formation of the Choson army, beginning from the Kabul reforms, you might be aware of that. Transport and communication infrastructure, and the beginnings of a modern education system and an entrepreneurial agriculture sector were all coming into being. With any luck, of course Choson had no luck, but with any luck, it could have muddled its way forward into becoming another Thailand instead of, like in many ways, another Burma, getting a very, very raw deal from its colonial tormentors. 1905 to 1910, something again I picked up, I'm not quite sure, I think it was mainly reading Gradanstev, Andrew Gradanstev, that's a very well-known book, one of the very early, 1942 I think. He has some amazing sources, and some of the assessments made by some, not huge numbers, but some Westerners at this time kind of make rather sad reading. And I thought it's worthwhile just pointing out, because they kind of get a bit under sort of my skin at times. This was an era of social Darwinism and popularity of eugenics. So this guy, George Kennan, who was one of Theodore Roosevelt's cronies, talked of the Koreans as the rotten product of a decayed Oriental civilization. These are not just these are people who have power and influence. And the ultimate was Webster's New International Dictionary in 1909, which described Korean as a member of the native race of Korea of an imitative rather than profound intelligence. Coming from a dictionary compiler, I find that rich. But there you go. Okay, moving forward into the Japanese era, I think we do need to remind ourselves, we need reminding just how dark the Japanese colonial era really was. It's easy to lose, it's easy to kind of lose sight of just what was actually going on. And again, I turn to our own transactions, where the redoubtable Monsieur Komatsu defines the task of the government general as that of advancing the intellectual and moral character of the new subjects of the empire by reforming all their antiquated and evil customs and manners in order to assimilate them completely to the original people of the empire. Korea, as we know it, would have ceased to exist if it hadn't been for Japanese military overreach in the 1930s and 40s. Again, looking at now, this is where kind of like the historian, or sort of the true historian, or the type of history that I really love. And I'll make another comment on this later to put it into further perspective. But a lot of the time, of course, necessarily, Korean history sort of focuses, is Korea-centric. Well, look, if you can't boss your own history, then what can you boss? So essentially, you choose the themes that are important, or that you believe are important in the context of your own country's history. But coming from outside that, a little bit like the same issue with the Hermit Kingdom and the invasions thing, I just found a much richer story emerges if we remember that the Japanese did pretty well what they wanted during their colonial period. And the chief limitation, or the chief interest to me in the story, was the way that it reflected what was actually happening in Japan. So a lot of the time it just sort of seems to me a little bit that when you write a history from an ethnocentric point of view, you say, these decisions were made there, and this is how they affected our people, and our people then did this. Well, kind of to get a little bit deeper into it, these decisions were made there in Tokyo, but the decision-making was not uniform. Japan was not just a remorseless conqueror and a remorseless suppressor of Korea. It had its ebbs and flows. The initial military expansionism period, when basically Japanese military expansionism became pathological in Manchuria, beginning in the wake of the Russo-Japanese War. Then sort of the period of Taisho democracy gradually started to have an impact on Japan's Korean policies. And it had as much to do with and the civilians who and the overall when they say Taisho democracy, in many ways it might be better to say Taisho constitutionality. But the civilians and the commoners who were who basically controlled the political process during that period, they had a lot to do with restraining the military and producing the circumstances in which the somewhat feeble but nevertheless real impact of the cultural policy in the early 1920s was felt. Then, of course, beyond that came gradually, as the 1920s wore on, the military and the extra constitutional forces reasserted themselves, and then by the 30s, militarism was triumphant, and Korea felt the full brunt of that. So, as I said, the story, to me, the story of the Japanese colonial period becomes much richer the more one burrows down into the way policies were actually determined in Tokyo. Coming forward into the 1950s, or the 45 to 50s, I find myself, perhaps just because I'm a stick in the mud, I find it, the assertion is almost universal that the Korean War was a civil war. I think really does need to be, it should not be asserted quite so confidently, and it does need to be heavily qualified. It starts to come, it emerges, I think, of course it's no secret that Bruce Cummings is was I think the person through his Origins book, was the person who initially proposed this, and it has become so widespread. And Cummings had a particular view of the Soviet occupation, which I think is very difficult to sustain in the light of all the Soviet archival, Soviet bloc archival material, and the idea of the Soviet occupation of the North being a wound of the Soviets showing up in Pyongyang in 1945 and saying, "How can we help?" Just does not really sort of survive closer scrutiny. Soviet has sort of, that's a very literal version of Mother Russia, I think, to call them but it was far more interventionist, and it produced a state, it privileged certain actors, it armed key actors in the North, and North Korean's state formation took place with far less reference to social forces in the North, and certainly than I think many people are prepared to acknowledge. Now, I'm not accepting the US from that, but the US was far less interventionist in the South, although likewise it did advance very specific political interests. And the influence of civil components in both the North and in the South simply cannot be separated from the background of massive foreign intervention. That is, without that story, you really don't have a story as to how the Korean War came about. I don't have too much to say about the Republic of Korea post-1945. It's mainly because I'm up to number 8 already, my God. The particular thing that I sort of tended to find, again, talk of leftists and centrists and rightists, progressive liberals and conservatives, I kind of feel that they don't tell us a great deal about rock politics very much at all. For example, especially conservative. I mean, anyone who sort of went out to the hustings under the banner of the Posudang, I think would get absolutely belted. Whenever people talk about conservative, referring to a given Korean grouping, political party or individual, call it what you will, as conservative, they have in mind, I think, something far different from what the word conservative means in the West, in Western countries, shall we say. Now, even in Western countries, of course, it means different things in different countries. In the United States, it's produced more, well, as a badge of pride to many to many Americans who proudly define themselves as conservative. In Australia, for example, it's not that way very much at all. Conservatism is seen to be much more on the margins of politics, and it's frequently. And so the term conservative is very often used by people who themselves don't feel very attracted towards conservatism, and so on. So there are issues that are really involved there. Well, the conservative one is the one that stands out, but likewise, of course, with liberal as well. The people, I think it is a truth generally acknowledged that the role of ideology in Korean politics is relatively restrained, and and one of the reasons for that is that there are so many other driving forces that tend to mute the force of ideology. Some of them are legacy issues, such as colonialism and nationalism. And of course, the heavy overlays of regionalism and especially personalism are very strong factors involved. Leftist, centrist, rightist, it's very hard to actually locate people. Personally, I should say, it's very hard for me to locate people, especially when you have a so-called decade of the left, which still left. Again, perhaps this is an external point of view, which is not, well, perhaps it's a little bit irrelevant, but nevertheless, which after a decade of, after the so-called decade of the left, to my best understandings, trade unions could not organise and fund political activities, which of course in most European countries the labour unions are the absolute foundation of major political parties. But there were wide areas where so-called leftist figures, there are broad areas of policy where so-called leftist candidate or leftist leaders simply do not touch. And similarly with liberals, there are broad areas, especially, well, shall we say, as an extension of what I said before about ideology, moral issues that don't seem to make their way very firmly into the public discourse as well. But I'll leave that part aside. Now, so I think I'm not suggesting that we sort of, we have a special vocabulary to describe Korea, but looking especially at the period since 1987, when relatively democratic politics prevailed. I think somehow establishment populist versus non-established populist would be a little bit more accurate, but of course it would also be more awkward. So anyway, that's in the end. I just found, again, I could not really explain how things progressed, how public policy in Korea progressed after 1987 without strong reference to the issues of populism and personalism. I'm not exactly saying something new there, am I? Right. Now, as somebody, no, it was the publishers actually, and kinder reviewers that noted that my history allocated almost equal time to North Korea, which is not always sort of to be found in general history books. So I'm going to now pass over to talking a little bit about the DPRK, which might be seen as self-serving, seeing I have another book about the North coming out, but nevertheless, the other issue, of course, this is extremely topical, and so it is naturally on our minds. The first thing that I would argue, that I found myself arguing, is, and I find myself at variance with quite a few quite well-known commentators, specialists, not to mention the generality of the commentariat and the international media, is that to date, the influence of private economic activity on broader issues is minimal in the North, and what is more, it is likely to remain so. It's kind of a curious thing, but Brother Anthony briefly referred to the fact that I served in Pyongyang as a diplomat back in 1975. And one of the curious things was that one of the major reason that the Australian embassy was established in Pyongyang in 1975, we were the first real Western Western country to do that. And the main reason was that the conviction of our government was that North Korea was opening up and that it was beginning a process of economic reform. Well, what is this, 45 years later? They're going about it awfully carefully. And this goes on, the mid-1980s, again an incredible flourish of sort of the Hermit Kingdom opens up, etc., etc. Again, it's just an extraordinary extent to which people conceive these enthusiasms for what seems to them like, well, they tend to get things around the wrong way, which they start with, this is a logical thing for the North to do, therefore they're doing it, is what it really tends to emerge as. And so moving through, whenever North Korea either directly or subliminally seems to adopt new policy directions, the immediate assumption, here's reform, this is reform, and so on. And this does not survive closer examination again. And it's not surprising if people stopped looking for the preordained outcome or trying to predicting the outcome. The origin of private economic activity in the North is that it was born of necessity during the famine, where the government basically told the people, fend for yourselves. We can't do everything, and one of the first things that has to go is your public distribution, is the public distribution of food. So you're not getting food from us anymore, fend for yourselves. And the other aspect is that it was done, so private economic activity came down from the government. It has remained under firm elite control, and it continues to serve chemist interests. So it's very easy to say, but there is a lot of private economic activity. Well, of course there is. Any fool can see that. It's somewhere in excess of 30% of, by most, I think, credible estimates, 30% of all economic activity in the North is private. But what have you said when you've said that? A lot of the time you've just made a quantitative statement. It's 30% of what? It's 30% of light industry, consumer goods. It's not 30% of machine tools and shipyards and so on. So that sort of, it needs to be thought through a bit clearly. That's why I say here that the influence on broader issues is minimal, because private interests are confined to peripheral sectors, consumer and light industries, some construction, and some mining. Rather amazingly, there's no effort to defend the North Korean won as a stable circulating medium. The Chinese yuan is basically has become almost the de facto currency. And this, again, You can't be looking at a market economy if you are simply abandoning any efforts to establish a stable circulating medium throughout your economy. And so the conclusion, and when I say that it's minimal and likely to remain so, my conclusion is there is no prospect of China-style reforms anytime soon. I know those prospects are put around quite frequently, but that's something that I do tend to disagree with. Okay, mainly on the grounds that there is no evidence. And again, this is the amazing thing. What evidence do people tend to throw up? A lot of the time, it's the Pyongyang skyline. It's the oh, I got a great cup of coffee in Pyongyang. How can you tell me things aren't changing? And various sort of things like that. They tend to be anecdotally driven. But well, if you just go through the speeches of the last Korean Workers' Party Congress, the 7th Korean Workers' Party Congress in May 2016, if you find a word on reform, please email me. I'll be desperate to read these inspired words. No, what you find instead is that isolation and autarky, economic autarky, are still central policies. Sanctions, criminal and rogue behaviour, monumental levels of corruption and past defaults deny the DPRK access to international capital and export markets. And Sangun, the collective policy framework, which means place the military first, it still underwrites the fundamental policy of nuclear-backed survivalism. The military still distorts the economy and absorbs a huge proportion of state resources. Okay, so that's more or less that's sort of a way that I do tend to find myself on the other side of the fence to sort of quite a frequent theme in North Korean commentary these days. The other one is that that concerns me considerably, especially in the light of events in the past, well, as we speak, shall we say. The way people seem quite happy, and in fact the international media in particular is keen to convey the DPRK as an erratic tin pot state and Kim Jong-un as some sort of Caligula. These are dangerously inaccurate pictures. Dangerously inaccurate. And what sort of going through in considerable detail the actual policy achievements of the North Koreans, especially under Kim Jong-il, is that it's consistently outmaneuvered much more powerful adversaries since the mid-1990s. I found actually, we talk a lot about North Korea being ideologically driven. I found the United States and the Republic of Korea far more ideologically driven, or at least strongly ideologically driven, whether you talk about neoconservatism in the United States or sunshine policy convictions in the South. The inability of those particular policy frameworks to acknowledge or to admit contrary evidence is quite staggering at times. And meanwhile, of course, the DPRK has just simply motored on slowly, carefully, till it has achieved its nuclear status. The DPRK, to me, has simple, single-minded goals, and it has a carefully compiled and rigorously executed playbook. And quite frankly, it is its adversaries that make this playbook look a bit more like the New England Patriots and less like the Cleveland Browns. Because really, if anything, its adversaries have pursued erratic tactics and strategies. The main issue that I've found, and sometimes just quite openly from leading people and leading negotiators, and especially in the United States, is that they placed all their chips on the collapsist scenario. So they really didn't mind if they negotiated building nuclear reactors in the north, because they had a strong conviction that they'd never really have to honour fully those commitments, or if somehow the nuclear reactor, the nuclear power stations in the north were finally completed, they would just be ready for the new government, for the new post-Kimist government that was sure to emerge in the north. And because they played for time and they were wrong, they are now in a strategic vacuum. And essentially that's what we're seeing today, the failings essentially of the DPRK's adversaries, who really have nowhere else to go. They want more from the north than the north wants from them, and they just don't know how to go about getting those things from the north. Of course, they want specifically denuclearization and a lot more besides, but they just simply have no leverage. Read Kim Jong-un, I'm sure you've read all these things about putting the Army Chief of Staff in the middle of the field and peppering him with anti-aircraft fire and various things like that. And the whole impression that emerges is of Kim Jong-un being a sort of a Caligula on the tin-on figure. Rock source disinformation and international media repetition is rife on this, until basically it almost becomes shorthand. You don't have to point to any evidence, you just have to point to previous mentionings of this particular image. So, just as a matter of curiosity, or just as a matter of interest, I should say, Chang Song-taek, he's Kim Jong-un's uncle by marriage, was the last fully documented purging of senior cadre. When you compare the Politburo as constituted 4 months after Kim Jong-un became leader, and when it was confirmed last May, it was stable. There's virtually nothing that was mysterious or that required any particular strong explanation. Tales of Kim purging and executing large numbers of senior military commanders are just, again, not borne out by close examination. There have been frequent changes in the top 2 or 3 military positions, but they are, well, essentially, one has to remember, of course, that Kim Jong-un is a commander-in-chief, and he is operating with a different agenda to the military people, and he is also attempting to update, I suppose would be one word, the Songun policy framework, which after all is now 20 years old. And so yes, he has been shuffling people in and out in an effort to find people who are responsive to his own particular policy requirements. And a lot of the time, the people who are shuffled out do not end up in a field under aircraft fire. They find themselves in quite honourable, almost semi-retirement, sinecure type positions. So, it is, let us be very clear that it is there is uncompromising, ruthless internal discipline, but no reign of terror. To be very clear to people, there's no sign of strategic uncertainty. North Korea continues just to move step by step by step by step towards its ultimate nuclear goals. So there we are. I've sort of, I've ended up talking a bit more about North Korea than perhaps I intended to. So let's just get through to the conclusions on this. All right. Broader themes, and this is purely subjective. Once again, reflects my own, shall we say, background, my own reading, my own upbringing, and my own very partial exposure to Korean society. I'm constantly struck by the perennial vigour of Korean civil society. This is just one of the first things that struck me when I landed as a relatively young person here in 1973. The extent to which people led extremely full lives, or they just went about their business, and the government was not really did not loom large in their daily lives. People went about their business, and that was that. This has been described by various people. I think the first to really emphasize it this way was Hagen Kuh, who described the strong state contentious society phenomenon. You have things like the inability of the so-called military authoritarian dictatorial Chun administration to have any significant impact on education policy. They're just simply because, if you have in this corner Chondovan, in this corner Chimaparam, I know where my money's going. So there we go. It's always an essential backstop to events throughout the modern era. And if we really do want to understand political events, just simply sort of focusing attention on what particular leaders and generals did is only part of the story. Just the continuing working out of Korean, of the normal working out of Korean society, it seems to me, has always formed an important check on the ambitions of leaders of all stripes. The other thing is a profoundly civilianized outlook seems embedded in Korean cultural DNA. Put it, might sound slightly awkward in that way. But, it was essentially civilianization, and just the profound civilianization that in the end saw off the Park-Chun era and a return to democracy in 1987. Park, especially in his earlier, in different guises at different times, Park was a really strong militarist, and there were all sorts of ways in which the Korean society, I don't need to tell, a lot of people here were here in the 1970s. You have good memories of what it was like. But in the end, that somehow did not do the sort of, that largely seemed to me to lie extraneously. And after 1987, the military only then, it seemed to be, tolerated, not ever embraced, retired to the barracks largely, and that is, and that in no small part is due to this the profound civilization of the society. Now, going back just simply to what I was saying before about the writing of history is, of course, Korea-centric, but I do find that broader perspectives are fruitful. Not just the recording of chessboard decisions and outcomes, in other words, decisions made in various capitals of the world, but also in-depth factoring in of ideologies and mindsets. These include Stalinism in the USSR. I'm still staggered at the paucity of books or of serious attempts to understand Stalinism in its North Korean context. That's just one example. The Chinese, their attitudes to the North Koreans today, a lot of that is we understand them better if we understand just the ingrained, what I call Little Kingdomism of China. Militarism domestic militarism in Japan, the extent to which it was imported and enforced in Korea is extremely important for understanding, especially the later period of the Japanese colonial period, and of course the Pax Americana role of the United States and their regional security role, obviously just had huge implications for Korea, for the Republic of Korea as well. So that's, I think, if I'm right, yes, okay. So that's about all I have to say. So I'm sorry if a lot of it was mundane, but after all, I just promised to talk about 10 things that I noticed while writing a general history. Thank you.
The first one was pressure. Can you shout? Okay.
thank you very much for the lecture. As a person of perhaps myself, bicultural and bilingual and by psychological character in me, I have to ask you a question which may be extremely difficult to answer or impossible to answer. I will be asking you about personal sense or wish or observation, etc., on how both sides of Korea to figure out what to do about this 70 years plus maybe next 70 years of perhaps separation, hostility, and whatever else you can think of. So that is my question. But I can expect this has to be only personal, perhaps impossible to answer. Okay?
Thank you. Interesting question. I heard some commentators say the other day that, wasn't the whole point of the United States' presence in the Republic of Korea to defend the Republic of Korea? There seems to have been some sort of massive mission creep here, that it now seems to be dedicated so strongly towards the denuclearization of the North. Now, obviously, there's a compelling case to connect the two. Nevertheless, you still have to be careful about what is more important. I don't sort of see too much, maybe because I don't read the South Korean press as much as I should. I don't see, all I seem to see is basically what the United States thinks about this, I think mainly because the United States is often so loud about what it thinks about North Korea. I don't know the extent to which South Korean government's views have been factored in. Now, it's not just that the North has had a careful playbook. When you keep the peace for 70 years under extraordinary pressures, it's clear that everybody has a careful playbook here. And the maintenance of those playbooks, to carry on my metaphor, if you like, is absolutely essential. And the degree of rhetorical, especially rhetorical creep that we've had over the past few weeks is obviously extremely dangerous and upsetting to that sort of, let's call it dynamic stability that we've been able to enforce. So I hope I didn't get too much off the topic, but that is the way that I would look at it.
Can I ask you a question?
Please.
Some time ago, Ned Schultz gave us a talk about the link or the continuity between colonial and modern Korea. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the continuity between Choson and modern Korea, because people talk about Confucian society or Confucian values, but from your perspective, to what extent is there a continuity between Choson, pre-modern, and today?
Well, in my book, sorry that I do have the occasional plug. Yeah, that's more or less the way I start things off, because that's about the fundamental question. The fundamental questions of change and continuity are, of course, the questions that excite all historians. There are as many answers to that, it seems, as there are Koreans. But let's broadly say that there are people who do go back and do feel a direct connection between Confucian values and their lives. This may in some respects be called social conservatism. And then but a lot of the time it's more or less, they believe in, or not believe in, but It's not about so much a belief. They accept Confucianism as long as Confucianism is given nothing to do. It's just simply, it's there, it's referred to, people are aware of it, but in many ways, a bit like sort of Christianity in many parts of the West, it is no longer a belief, it is a culture, or it is a set number of practices. So I still see Koreans as very as very strongly influenced by Confucianism, but of course Confucianism is such an immense edifice. I think it's not really understood just how hugely it hangs over practically all facets, not just of daily life, but through to the cosmos. The full edifice of Neo-Confucianism is gone, but the actual daily practices, the immediate acceptance of hierarchy, especially the 5 relationships and the 3 cardinal virtues. Personally, and I'm not a resident of Korea, but in all my time here, I've always found them to be strong.
Another question, yeah.
You mentioned the strategic goal of North Korea to be nuclear weapons. But besides that, and besides Kim Jong-un maintaining power, what are the strategic goals of the elite in North Korea? Because their life really isn't getting that much better compared to the rest of the world.
And they don't care, because you have to define they. This is a state where the elite rules, and where the elite has been the party and military and governmental elite was quite happy to make decisions that led to the starvation of 1 million people. We call it the famine, and I hate this kind of, well, basically, there was the same thing about the Irish famine as well. It's the Irish potato famine. It's not very often known that there was a lot of food in Ireland at the time of the Irish potato famine. It was just a matter of distribution. It's the same in the north. So whose North Korea are we talking about, and what level of commitment to maintain their privileged position in society are we talking about in the North? So you can dismiss the idea of raising the sort of the standard of living for the people as a whole as a goal in North Korea. It's survivalism of the elite, and it's very, very hard for anyone to argue one of the best ways to guarantee your survival is to have an extremely strong countervailing threat against people who want to alter that status quo. Yes?
Can I ask you to expand on a line in your last? Can I ask you to expand on a line on in your last slide where you mentioned the inevitable triumph of civilianism in the north?
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering how you think that's going to come about.
Yeah.
Because you say yourself that there's no reform on the agenda.
Yeah.
But certainly there's no sign of any organised dissent in the north. Diplomats will tell you that they don't even hear individuals ever express it. China ruthlessly crushes dissent, and there's no sign of any change there. Why do you think it happened in North Korea? And how?
Well, the germ of that idea to me came through reading defector testimony or refugee testimony, and just looking at all the anecdotes that came out of the period of the famine. One person described it as they survived through an act of mass civil disobedience, because essentially they just went out and started to sell whatever they could get their hands on. They just did, in a way, reminiscent, I'm sure, of what happened in the South, both during and in the immediate aftermath of the Korean War. They did what was necessary. They just did the necessary. They survived. and within 4 or 5 years, you had 80 or 90% of the defector population saying that they had relied on private economic activity for the major part of their income. It just seems like this, and then you see other little things. My heritage is Albanian. Despite the fact that basically the Albanian communists were the gold standard in sort of repression in European communism, once they basically abandoned or basically opened themselves up to an electoral process and were booted out, this civil society, quite a reasonable given the circumstances, civil society, Albanian civil society, just crawled out again, as though it had been in some sort of hibernation throughout the entire period of communist rule. Drawing these things together, I just see in the response of ordinary non-elite Koreans to the famine, starvation, an extraordinary sort of tenacity, which I think how can I actually describe it this way? Which is very relevant, I think, to the future. Because by what they did, they forced the government to accept a very firmly circumscribed role for private economic activity. But the government did not want to do that. Kim Jong-il spent most of his time between 2002 and 2009 trying to put the genie back in the bottle, and he failed. So there is... and there are, of course, almost directly because of that, multiple breaches in the information firewall. There are all sorts of ways in which various parts of Korean society are significantly different today. Eventually, and I wouldn't bother, I just could not put a time on it. Eventually, I feel that has to have some sort of political repercussion. I don't know how, I don't know where or when, because we are living in an era where the government still has near total control of the repression, the repressive means of government. So I hope that's helpful.
It's one of the most optimistic scenarios for change in North Korea that I've ever heard, and I hope you're right. I think major differences between civil disobedience in the Park-Chun era and in North Korea today is even in the worst Park-Chun era repressions, you still had a very robust, anti or people demonstrating self-immolation, distributing literature, getting news in from the outside, which I acknowledge is now coming into North Korea. I think you had a very, very different level of oppression in South Korea in the 70s and 80s than you do have in North Korea today. And I think you mentioned it yourself, is that the very institutions, the economic institutions that have grown in North Korea in the post-famine era, even they are not really vehicles for change because they only survive in the repressive North Korean regime. I mean, if E-Mart goes in there, all of those little stores are going to disappear. So I hope you're right. It'd be great if civil disobedience brings down North Korea, but the level of suppression and the level of state control in North Korea today, from my limited knowledge, is far, far more severe than we had at the worst of the Park-Chun era. So, I hope you're right.
Oh, I couldn't agree more that we're a long, long, long way off. But I do believe in some sense the genie is out of the bottle now. To what extent this is a big development or a small development, it just seems to me it's a development of just potential significance. Otherwise, we're probably still in the Syngman era in the north. There's so many. When you look at the actual scale of economic activity and so on, it just seems to resemble a Sigmund Reed era more than anything else. That's how far we have to go before economic activity really starts to generate social change and eventually have an impact on authoritarian government.
And do you see that economic activity coming?
No, because it's understood. Well, but I can't say 100%. I just have to point that whatever happens, you have to begin the debate with the obvious observation that it is strongly under elite control, and they have shown themselves to be utterly ruthless in maintaining that control.
Thank you very much. Thank you.